Hello, and welcome to God versus God, the podcast where we pit ancient gods against one another for the chance at the ultimate comeback to help save the world. And we are in episode 3 of season 2, looking for an Egyptian god to join our season 1 winner. So I think we're getting used to the Egyptians at this point. And this episode, I have Thoth, the god of wisdom, and Matt, you have Set, the god of chaos.
Right.
So when we started this, I approached Matt about saving the world through the medium of podcasting, as one does.
Right. Naturally.
I gave him two examples of podcasts to listen to. One of which you may recall, Matt, was our friends at Grim Reading.
Yes.
Where they read and review a grim fairy tale each episode.
Yes.
Now, in that podcast, every time there's a particularly bloody or dismemberment heavy episode, they give a little warning that episode is going to be certified grim. Right?
It's very kind of
them.
So,
yeah. And now I don't know exactly what Matt's going to say about Set, the god of chaos, or which stories he's chosen to highlight. Perhaps there's a long tale about Set bringing meditative rock gardening to Egypt. Matt's going to focus on. I don't know. But from what we heard about Set in the Osiris episode and the stories that I did run across about Set myself, I think we can probably say that this episode is going to be certified Set.
Yeah.
For violence, trickery, and divine mutilation. Is that accurate, Matt?
That is highly accurate. That only begins to describe the debauchery to be had in the second segment of the program. Once you're able to give us the story of Thoth, if I'm saying that correct, right. I believe I am.
That is the correct pronunciation. So, with that warning, I think there's something else you wanted to tell our listeners, Matt.
Well, yes, just as a point of order. As you know, Andrew, the god of chaos in ancient Egyptian tradition described using two different spellings, right? So you've got Set, S-E-T, and then you've got Seth,
right,
which was sort of based on the ancient Greek version of it. The consonant was a little different at the end. Now, I have opted for this episode to go with Set, with just the one T, for a few reasons. First of all, brevity. Simple as that. We're just going to save some time.
Right.
Standing to our high level of respect for the listener's time that has become the hallmark of this program. Second, if this matchup were going to be Thoth versus Seth, I wish we'd sound like a couple of intoxicated cottonmouths, and maybe even more than we normally do. And I don't know, Thoth versus Seth might also be interpreted even incorrectly as offensive to people experiencing speech impediments. I don't know if the Lisp community might be up in arms, so we'll avoid that. I think probably most of all, the name Seth just does not have an ancient Egyptian vibe. It's more like, it gives you the vibe of like a middle-aged white guy. It's like it's Seth Rogen, Seth Meyers. We all know some guy from college with the ball cap and really into his grill and his March Madness brackets. Good old Seth. But when you've got all these great Egyptian names like Ra, Osiris, even Tefnut, it just seems wrong having a Seth in the mix. That would be the equivalent
Throws
of
it
our
off.
If our first season had like Apollo versus Bruce, or Poseidon versus Carl, just doesn't quite work. So I just want to establish up front, Set, S-E-T, is what it's going to be for the second part of our program. But that being established, please kick us off with the first part in season 2, episode 3, Thoth versus Set.
That's right. Well, I'm very glad that I did not certify this episode Seth.
Yeah,
and it would not have had the same ring.
A lot of paperwork involved if we'd done that. So yes,
exactly. So before we get into the meditative rock gardening, I'm going to tell everyone a little bit about Thoth, the god of wisdom, god of writing, patron of scribes, god of medicine. He's a moon god, creator god, and more. So we'll see if this segment is certified wise. Now, the name Thoth comes to us through the Greeks via the Demetic Egyptian writing, but based on the hieroglyphic version of his name, it would be Tehuti or Jehuti. Now there is, of course, as a linguist, there's a very logical, straightforward linguistic explanation for how the pronunciation slid from Tehuti to Thoth, which I read and frankly did not follow in the least. But in the etymology terms, via the hieroglyphic version, Thoth's name, the meaning's pretty clear. It means ibis-like guy, or guy who is like an ibis, because he is usually pictured as a man with a head of an ibis. And so I think that brings us to our season 2 now mainstay of where we share the picture and have you describe for the listener what it is that you're seeing.
Yes. So you mentioned a guy with an ibis head. So the head looks like some kind of, is it a bird? Like a swan?
It is a bird.
Okay.
Ibis is a bird, yeah.
For those of us who are not as much into birds, just to establish that. So I'm seeing, yes, a big, long, kind of downward bending beak. I'm seeing a now familiar sort of disc above the head. Hard to say if that is a solar disc.
No,
or a lunar disc.
It is a lunar disc. Yes. We've switched our discs. All right. For this episode.
Very clearly, very, very disc forward. It looks like he's also holding some sort of boy, it's hard to tell. It looks like some sort of ruler with a couple of holes in it and maybe a paintbrush. You may have to explain that one.
I will. So what he's got there is he's got a stylus and a little writing board, and he's writing some hieroglyphics on it. This is symbolizing him as the god of scribes and the creator of writing.
Okay, very good.
So we've got him mid-action, doing a little writing.
I thought it might have been just like a very early skinny iPad of some kind with like an Apple Pencil, but no. So clearly sort of very dark complected. He's got a nice sort of a form-fitting kind of a man skirt underneath the belt. And then there looks like either an extended belt or perhaps a tail that is extending most of the way down his backside.
Yeah, that's good. I think you've hit the main point. But he's got the solar disc. He's got the ibis head with that long curved beak that was supposed to refer back to sort of a crescent moon. I think that's why the ibis was a symbol of the moon. And got the moon up above his head, and he's caught there in the act of writing. So and he had a little ankh on his belt, just kind of hanging off the belt.
Oh yeah, I didn't see the ankh. Yeah, good. Glad you pointed that out.
Yeah. So that is though. So for everybody, if you're picturing there, just picture a guy with a long bird neck and tiny bird head and beak. So yes. that's what we're dealing with through this whole episode.
Right.
Unless he's a baboon, which he may be at certain times.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. So that's his ibis form. He has a baboon form. He could, of course, appear just as a regular dude with a dude head, but that's rare. I'm gonna give you a couple epithets that were applied to Thoth, also give us an idea of how he was thought of by the Egyptians, and these are all gonna sort of come up later. So we had Thoth, Lord of the Ogdoad. Okay. And Thoth without a mother. And he is Thoth, the place taker of Ra.
Place taker.
And the last, the place taker of Ra. So that's some lost in translation a little bit there. And Thoth, the thrice great. Which you may recall from season 1, but we'll get back to that. So, one of those epithets, Thoth without a mother, is probably referring to a couple of the different origin myths for Thoth. So he has the sort of hometown of Kenenemu, which is known in the Greek as Hermopolis, because he was associated with Hermes.
Right.
And Thoth there was considered to have been self-created, and in his hometown, he was considered to have been the creator god. So according to their mythology, in the beginning, there were these 8 primordial deities or entities with a male and female pairing for each of these 4 different primordial forces. We've got the boundless waters, which we've seen before, and we've got infinity, darkness, and secrecy. And so there's a male and female version of each of those, these 8 deities who are known as the Ogdoad. And Thoth apparently was the master thereof, so he's master of the Ogdoad. And these 8 primordial deities get together, and they form the Mount Benben that we've heard about before.
Right.
So it's them who forms the Mount Benben, not Ra in their version. And then Thoth comes along in ibis form and lays an egg on the little mountain, and out of that egg hatches Ra, the sun. So in that version, he is actually the mother of Ra, or father of Ra. Now, this is only in Hermopolis that they go for that, but the prevailing view outside of there was that Thoth may have been the eldest son of Ra, sun god. There are some less common references to Thoth being born from a goddess's menstrual fluid, which again, connection to the moon, the cycles.
Sure.
And then there's another version of his origin that is actually tied to Set, which you may have come across. And we'll get into that a little bit later, probably. But that again involves him not having a mother. So
yes.
So a lot of different versions to choose from of how Thoth came about. But
interesting in that first one, that if he were a self-created god, he chose to create himself with a giant bird head. That's a interesting, daring choice.
Yeah, I think he originally went with just full ibis, and then he compromised later.
Okay.
With just the ibis head.
Got it.
Couldn't let that go.
Yeah.
So, however he's created, one of his primary early roles was going to be act as sort of the vicar of Ra, as his assistant, carrying out his will, carrying out his orders on Earth while Ra is up in the sky. But early on, there was at least one instance where he disobeyed the boss's orders. So, most famous of this is when Ra wanted to sleep with the goddess Nut, who was goddess of the sky. She's also the famous heavenly cow, and Nut was the love of Geb, the god of the earth, and happened to be Ra's granddaughter. So very understandably, she gave a hard pass to that suggestion. Choosing to go with Geb, her brother, which for the gods seems more appropriate.
Right.
And they marry, and soon she's pregnant. But unfortunately, Ra doesn't just leave it there. In his jealousy, he gives Nut a curse, and he says that she cannot give birth in any of the 12 months, and he names off the 12 months. You can't do it in this month, you can't do it in Thoth's month, you can't do it in that month. So that's a problem. She's pregnant with 4 children, but Thoth, he's not having this. He decides he's going to step in. Now, he can't oppose Ra just outright. He's got to think of a clever way to get around this rule. So the Egyptian calendar at that point, it was a lunar calendar with 12 months of 30 days, which worked out perfectly, for the 360-day calendar year at the time, right? So, but Thoth thinks that maybe this is a weakness, and he knows that the moon, who rules the calendar, has a bit of a weakness for gambling. So he challenges the moon to a game of checkers, and the bet is that if he wins, the moon has to give him 1/72 of its light.
Wow.
So now Thoth, he's the god of wisdom, while the moon is kind of a shiny rock. So he's got this one in the bag. He wins the game of checkers and claims 5 days outside of any month, and that allows these 5 created days, expands the calendar, and allows Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Set to be born. And then 1 day extra for Nut to recover. So,
all
so
because of one game of checkers.
yeah, so there you go. Those extra 5 days we ordered to that. So apparently Ra doesn't have any hard feelings about this, because at the end of the Book of the Heavenly Cow, which is that book about the human rebellion and sun god Ra's withdrawal to the sky, Ra starts reordering the world and handing out new assignments to other gods. And Thoth gets a number of jobs there, including being the vicar of Ra, sort of his point person while he's up in the sky. He's going to be the advisor to the rulers of Egypt. Thoth is put in charge of the moon, who it's decided obviously cannot look after itself. And he's going to be the god of wisdom and the god of scribes. So a lot of different jobs, but
yeah, got some good ones though. Pretty good portfolio.
Yeah, he's got a lot on his plate. So, throughout that fight in episode 2, between Osiris and Set, we didn't really talk about it, but Thoth plays a supporting role in that, advising Osiris in that role as the advisor to the ruler of Egypt. So we can only assume that the god of wisdom took the night off of the party.
Yeah.
When Osiris got himself tricked into getting in a coffin, he didn't feel like attending. Not really a party guy. So
no, that definitely could have used a little of that counsel. Could
right.
King Osiris at that night? Yeah.
Yeah, but he then Isis was put in charge, so he just goes, all right, well now it's my job to advise her, and he advises her with her pregnancy. He gives her magic. Well, actually, he gives her magic to help her put Osiris back together and help her get pregnant from Osiris, and then crucially does protect her when she's pregnant with Osiris's child, who's gonna go on to become Horus the Younger, the sky god. So I suspect we're gonna hear a little bit in the second half of this episode that when Mummy Osiris went down to the underworld, that didn't actually end the conflictual family situations.
It did not.
For these gods. So
there was some unfinished business. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't want to go into it now, but I will say that Thoth does play a supporting role there. Yes. A little bit of judging, as well as some emergency medical care provider, which becomes
excellent
quite
foreshadowing.
necessary.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned in the last episode, Thoth, on behalf of Ra, finds and persuaded Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, to come back to Egypt when she had left. But there are a couple things from that distant goddess story from Thoth's perspective that I wanted to bring up. One is that the goddess Mahat, who you will recall is an aspect of Tefnut, and I didn't realize this at the time, was also a consort of Thoth's, which could have made things pretty awkward that he was searching for Tefnut with Tefnut's husband Shu.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, the aspect bit of the Egyptian gods is still a little bit of a mystery. Still sorting that out, but I don't know if it's kind of a Friday night is for your husband and Saturday night is for your aspect's boyfriend sort of situation. But they seem to get along and didn't cause too much. They got the mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, but after that successful mission, maybe possibly to sort of smooth things out, Thoth is married off to the goddess Nemetawe, who is not a real famous goddess, but she is the hometown Hermopolis deity and was a goddess of justice. So, which seemed like a good match for him. Maybe smooth things out with Shu, kind of clear that situation up.
Right.
And then we also see stories telling the abilities in the tale to use fables in that tale of Tefnut. He uses fables such as the mouse that saves the lion to persuade Tefnut that she needs to come home to Egypt. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Thoth is credited with creating writing, but he's also known as a writer himself. He didn't just invent the alphabet; he is, in his own right, a writer and a storyteller. and was the patron of scribes. So this later Christian writer, Clement of Alexandria, claimed that there were 42 books written by Thoth and guarded and used by Egyptian priests that contained, quote, the whole philosophy of the Egyptians.
Wow.
But in addition to this, Thoth was credited with writing 36,525 books.
Oh my.
According to the Egyptian historian Manetho. So it has a very specific count. So you know that Manetho must have counted them.
Yeah, you don't just throw that number out there. That's very specific. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to list them all for us now.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm going to get a little more comfortable here.
Unfortunately, the full list has been lost, but
yeah.
he just gave us the title. He didn't give us all of them. The appendix that had the full list somehow got lost. So
it's too bad.
But but both the Egyptians and the Greeks, as I said, credited Thoth with teaching humans ritual, hymns, architecture, medicine, astrology, and geography, among other topics. So he would have had a lot of material to deal with, to work with, for writing all those books.
Sure. Yeah, big time.
So, but that core 42 books that were mentioned by Clement would have been kept and guarded in one of Thoth's temples as part of a secret protected knowledge that was only accessed by the priests and cared for by them, because the books were considered sort of that powerful.
Sure.
But there is, in mythology at least, one book that Thoth wrote that was too powerful and dangerous even for the relatively safe care of the inner sanctum of one of his temples. And so the book had to be hidden and became just a rumor. But unfortunately, as we know, that makes humans just want the book more.
That's right.
So in the Tale of Setne, tells the story of their two princes of Egypt who went to incredible lengths to get their hands on the Book of Thoth. So the story goes that this Prince Setne, who was also a priest and a magician kind of in his spare time, at some point had heard that the very Book of Thoth was buried in the tomb of a prior prince of Egypt named Nanefer Kapata. So I'm just going to call him Nanefer, which I think is what his friends called him. So shorten it up again for the brevity, for the sake of the audience.
That's right. Every second counts.
Time. Right. So in that greatest of Egyptian tradition, Setne decides he's going to rob the tomb where this book is buried.
Yeah.
And he breaks into the tomb, but when he gets in, he's confronted by the ghosts of Nanefer and his wife Awer and their son. So the wife proceeds to tell Setne their story as a warning to try and convince him not to steal the book, that it's too much trouble.
Yeah.
So she gives a little aside about how her and Nanefer managed to convince their father to let them marry despite being brother and sister, which is a little bit of a cringe romantic tale. But then she gets to the meat of the story, where this priest tells Nanefer where the Book of Thoth is for the price of 1,000 silver pieces and a double tax-free priest's stipend. So the priest has got this all thought out. He's like,
yeah, clearly this
double
is
stipend.
He came to the bargaining table already. Yeah.
Yeah, and no taxes on that either. So the priest says that there are magic spells in the book that, quote, when you recite this first spell, you will charm the sky, the earth, the netherworld, the mountains, and the waters. You will discover what all birds of the sky and all reptiles are saying. You will see the fish in the deep. When you recite the second spell, it will happen that whether you are in the netherworld or in your form on earth, you will see Ra appearing in the sky and the moon in its form rising. So you will get from this book, you have spells that will enable you to charm the sky and the mountains, talk to animals, and see the gods.
Wow.
And so Nanefer decides, that's worth it. He hands over the money, gives him the stipend, and makes the deal. And so he finds out that the book is at the bottom of the middle of the Red Sea, which is a sea off the west coast of Egypt. And he is told that it is in a box of iron. And in the box of iron is a box of copper. And in the box of copper is a box of juniper wood. And in that juniper wood box is a box of ivory. And in the box of ivory is a box of silver.
My goodness.
And in that box of silver is a box of gold. And in that box is the book.
Okay.
And then it is under 6 miles of serpents and scorpions of all kinds of reptiles around the box.
My goodness.
And then wrapped around the box is the eternal serpent. So
all he promised to give him for this money was the location of the book.
Oh, yeah.
He's received that location. Now it's up to him to retrieve the actual book.
Right.
Wow.
So this is before the invention of two-factor identification. so this is the security system that Thoth goes with, because the book is that dangerous.
Yeah.
So Nanifer goes out on the Red Sea with a crew of magically animated wax men with the help of his own magic spells, and then he disperses the serpents and scorpions, all except for the eternal serpent, who has to swim down and vanquish in a battle under the ocean water, defeats him, and retrieves the book.
Nice.
And brings it up to surface. So immediately, Nanifer and his wife recited the spells from the book and were able to understand the animals and charm all of nature. And then Nanifer has an interesting sort of study technique that he uses. He copied the book into another book. Then he dissolves the copy in beer.
Oh.
And then he drank the beer and was able to, from that, he knew and remembered all of the contents of the book.
Where was that study technique when we were in college? My goodness.
Yes.
We had to do those things separately. The book learning and the beer drinking. If only we'd known. My goodness.
Had we known. But finally, Thoth becomes aware of what's going on. He gets the alarm, and he goes to Rod, gets permission to punish Nanifer for taking the book and killing his now less than completely eternal serpent. So he got permission to attack not only Nanifer, but also anyone who, quote, belonged to him. So unaware of this, Nanifer and his family head back to Memphis on the Nile. They get a couple miles out of the dock, and Nanifer's son falls overboard and is drowned. So he uses the magic to fish the kid's body out of the river. They head back to where they started, have a funeral, and then restart the journey. But this time, his wife falls over at the exact same spot.
Oh, my goodness.
So again, Nanifer has to fish her out. He uses a spell this time to get her ghost to tell the story of what happened. And her ghost is like, yeah, it's Thoth. He's pissed. We're going to have to go back to town. So he goes back to town. He has the funeral, and he heads back out by himself. But this time, he's broken. And in shame, he ties the book to his body and throws himself overboard at that same spot. But for him, unluckily for him, his body is then caught by the rudder of the ship and dragged all the way back to Memphis with the boat. And they discover it once they're back, and the pharaoh decides to bury the cursed book with his dead son.
Yeah. So
this is all being told to Setne in the tomb. And Setne hears the story and is not the least bit dissuaded. It's like, yeah, great story, perhaps, but I'm taking the book.
Yeah.
So needless to say, things don't go too well for Setne after he takes it, but it is another deity, Bastet, who is the one who deals the punishment this time on Thoth's behalf. So I'm going to leave that bit of it for another episode.
Got it.
Other than to say, at one point, Setne wakes up in the middle of the street with his erect in the clay pot before finally returning the book. So
you'll leave us with that image. How we get there, we'll have to wait for another day.
Yeah, so record scratch. You may be wondering how I got there.
Oh my goodness, that's quite a
So
cliffhanger.
it is. So there we have that Thoth, god of wisdom, medicine, writing, author of many books, ibis-like guy, and a candidate for return to help save our troubled world.
Yeah. And for all those whatever 30 some thousand books, the one that kind of survived really might have been more trouble than it was worth once people
That's
got their
true,
hands
yeah.
on it. Yeah. Excellent. Wow. Well, there's a lot that I didn't know about Thoth when we began this conversation, and filling in the blanks. So I appreciate that.
All right.
Excellent. Well, we'll take our break there and ruminate
Yeah.
on such matters. We'll be back right after the break with our second half and Set just after this. And we are back with the second part of season 2, episode 3, Set, the God of Chaos. That's his primary title. Also, as we've learned with these Egyptian gods, some subtitles: the god of deserts, storms, disorder, violence, and foreigners. So in the day, whenever something really bad would happen in ancient Egypt, it's a sandstorm, an earthquake, a flash flood, the people would always whisper, that is Set doing his thing. That is his mark on the world. So before we get any deeper on Set, let's go and show you an image here, Andrew, and get your take on the visual of the god of chaos when you are ready.
All right, I see it now. All right, so we have, again, a man's body and kind of a long-nosed animal, then with two square, I think, ears that are sticking up.
Yep.
Black animal has a black face and a sort of blue headdress off of it. He's got that familiar Egyptian pose with shoulders facing us, hips sort of turned forward, and profile of the image. He's carrying an ankh, symbolizing life, and he's carrying a scepter, I guess to symbolize rule. He again has a little bit of a man skirt on, bare legs, a bit of a summer look. Got some bangles going on. It's looking good.
Yeah, and a little bit of a tail, kind of similar to what we saw with Thoth in the first half. Yeah, excellent. Well, you once again chose the relevant parts of the image. I'll do a little bit of explaining. So you had a hard time explaining which animal the head was, and that's understandable because it's impossible to say. You said, it's a curved head, kind of a downward long snout. You mentioned the square-topped ears. There is a tail that I mentioned now, just sort of like an arrow. It's often described as an erect tail, but in this image, it's clearly flaccid. So the animal represented in the head, so clearly hard to say. It is actually an enigmatic animal that appears in art of the time, but not in art since then. So it's exclusive to ancient Egypt. It is known simply as the Set animal, and you'll see it in all sorts of images throughout Egyptian art. Not just Set himself, but this animal appears in many scenes. So a fictional animal, not believed to be found in nature, and it's sort of an artistic combination of kind of the most chaotic animals all rolled into one. So it's sort of it's an aardvark, an African wild dog, a donkey, hyena, jackal, a pig, antelope, a giraffe, an okapi, a saluki, and a fennec fox. So
I thought I saw some aardvark in there because I saw a little bit of Arthur in there.
Yes, exactly. So the longer that list gets, the more kind of obscure the animals become. Unless, I should note, if we've got any listeners who are alumni of Southern Illinois University and their beloved mascot, in which case, go Salukis. And I should also mention, since I just heard of the animal known as a raccoon dog in the papers just last week. Potential trouble that those critters may have gotten into in Wuhan around 2020. We'll include that in the profile of the Set animal as well. So we'll add that to the list.
Yeah, could be.
Now, as for Set himself, in the late period, as far as his animal nature goes, toward the final days of like the ancient Egyptian religion, he was either portrayed as what you saw there, sort of a man with the head of a donkey, to simplify it, or in some cases, just a guy with a donkey mask on, which is kind of sad. I mean, it's like you get to the last couple seasons of a show that used to be really good. The viewership is down, the budgets are tighter, and you realize you've devolved from this really majestic, incredible unknown animal to like some dude with some kind of cut rate, eyes wide shut mask. So really sad ending. But for our
Yeah.
purposes here, for this episode, we're going to remember him in his prime and consider that head to be the Set animal in all of its multi-creature glory. You noted the scepter. That, of course, is the Waz scepter. We've seen that in the last couple of episodes. It represents power, rule, as you said. Looking more closely at the scepter, there is a sort of a stylized animal head at the top.
Okay.
And fork at the bottom. Now, the early gods like Set would carry this. It would later be carried by the pharaohs and the kings of Egypt. And on one hand, it's not surprising because Set was both a god and would become a pharaoh. But two curiosities. So the animal head on the top of that scepter was often a representative of the Set animal itself. Okay. So Set's signature look involved an accessory that essentially features himself. So, which I think is kind of the fashion equivalent of like Jesus Christ wearing a gold chain with a cross on it. Just seems a little off. And the Waz scepter was also a symbol of not just control, but control specifically over the forces of chaos. So here's Set, who is the origin of all chaos, and yet carries a staff that controls it. So very clever way to kind of hedge his bets there. I thought that was pretty thoughtful. You mentioned the Ankh. So carrying that symbol, of course, we've seen this before. It's the symbol of both life, and also it is the hieroglyphic word for life, which, when you think about it, is a little bit strange. So, it's the equivalent, I guess, of if you wanted to honor life by holding a sign that had the word life on it, or if you, maybe like a box of Life cereal, I guess would do that. Perhaps an old copy of Life magazine. So I do have to mention when I was a small child, and this is true, for a little while, I thought the word pro-life meant somebody who prefers Life magazine to Time magazine. That is true. And at first I thought, man, these pro-life people, they get real intense about their choice of reading
magazines.
Later, I did learn what the term really means. It turned out, in fact, those folks aren't really much into having choices at all. So that was the lesson.
That's true.
And you mentioned, of course, the form-fitting gold man skirt to complete the look. So very well observed there. Kind of giving you a good visual of where Set's coming from. And you alluded earlier, we did encounter Set in a guest appearance in our previous episode in the myth of Osiris. Right. Like his older brother Osiris, son of Geb the earth, as you said, Nut the sky. We will also recall that his siblings Isis and Osiris, who were married, Set also married his other sister Nephthys. So they kind of followed in each other's footsteps there. Had one child with her, Anubis. The parentage, you'll recall, was disputed. But by some accounts, Set also had some clandestine couplings outside the border. So he was the god of foreigners. He would occasionally slip off to a foreign land, had some dealings with a couple of goddesses from outside of Egypt named Anat and Asart. And from them came a crocodile deity named, of all things, Maga, M-A-G-A. Now, we don't really hear much of anything about whatever became of Maga. But given that name, there's something kind of pleasant to the absence of a further story. This is, you go back far enough in history, there's at least one Maga who knows how to keep quiet after a while. Just kind of nice. So we heard quite a bit in the previous episode about how Set earned that reputation as the god of chaos. Of course, he was envious of his big brother, King Osiris, pulled off that party trick with his gang of goons, trapped him in the fancy casket, took over as king as soon as he sent him down the river. Now, you'll also recall Isis brought her husband Osiris back to life after she found him. Set had him killed a second time, of course, cut into 14 pieces, distributed throughout all of Egypt in his parts. Now, in the middle, in that little interregnum between the two deaths of Osiris, Iris, as you mentioned, managed to get, after resurrected, impregnated Osiris, which led to the birth of their son, Horus the Younger. So Osiris was, of course, reconstituted. We couldn't quite come back as king, so he was essentially retired to be the Lord of the Afterlife. So this sort of combination of Supreme Court, Chief Justice, and kind of Walmart breeder all rolled into one. And then this new king, Set, even though he had clearly taken over under very sneaky circumstances, and even by all accounts that he was a terrible ruler, but he still got to stay in charge because he was the next in line. So Horus, who was this posthumously conceived son of King Osiris, didn't forget what his old uncle Set had done to his dad. So once he grew up a little bit, he, in the immortal words of O.J. Simpson on his first Twitter post, he had some scores to settle and got right to it. So that desire to become recognized as who should be the rightful king rather than Set by Horus. It tees off what I can only describe as, I'd say, the longest and certainly the most bizarre mano-a-mano rivalry in recorded history. Now, that is, of course, the conflict of Horus and Set. So you'll hear, I mean, it's all the great rivalries rolled into one. It's like the Red Sox and the Yankees, the Bears and Packers, the Coyote and the Roadrunner. It's like all of those, but if they all featured some sort of weird incestuous sexual overtones. So that times about 100. So at its heart, the dispute is all about which descendant of the king deserves to be the next king. So a little bit of Succession, a little bit of Game of Thrones. Technically a legal battle between Horus and Set, and it's argued before this tribunal called the Aeneid, group of deities. I think you may have mentioned them in the last episode. Kind of a panel of judges, sort of similar to the Olympians, which we knew from season 1. So included in this panel, depending whose story you believe, you've got probably the creator Ra Atum, who invented kingship in the first place. So he's essentially the head judge. Geb, the father of Set, is the judge of the trial, sort of beneath Atum, according to many of these. Shu, the god of air, is on the tribunal. Now Thoth, who you talked about in the first half of this episode, in most accounts gets involved as like a judge's assistant. So he's, in the same way that he was sort of that vicar, I think, to Ra, he's sort of like a bailiff in this situation, sort of the guy who kind of gets the little jobs done in the courtroom. So this is the version of Thoth and his participation in this. I know that there are some slightly different variations that we'll get to in a little bit, but I'll give you the one that is the main story. And in that one, he is the bailiff. Also, Isis shows up here and there to help out her son. So from the beginning, this is essentially just a bunch of family members who represent the tribunal. So, the legal system fraught with conflict from the start. It's one of the teams from Family Feud is also the justice system. But at the time that, it's early days, there aren't that many authority figures back then. So they just worked with the ones they had. And this legal battle ended up lasting for no fewer than 80 years. That is how contested Horus and Set was in front of this tribunal. So the first episode, as they call it, is known as the contendings of Horus and Set. Now, that's a very unusual word. Contending is like a very major struggle. So this is not just like a skirmish or a kerfuffle. It's like on the level of like a Kampf or a jihad, if you will, top shelf problems. And yet, despite the gravity, it starts with honestly some pretty lightweight legal arguments. Set begins in his opening statement, and he argues that Horus cannot be the king because his breath stinks. Because he was breastfed by his mother, Isis, and that happened so recently that he apparently still has bad breath. Not a great opening line. He's kind of, you see what he's trying to do. It's sort of like a rap battle where he's throwing shade at the beginning just to go a little chaos out there. In a way, even though the joke is rather clumsy, it does a double whammy. It pokes fun at Horus's relative youth. And also just kind of slips a your mama joke in there at the same time. So it does kind of pull that off. But enough of the schoolyard taunts. This is serious business. The throne of Egypt is at stake. This isn't going to bring us to a conclusion. So Set ups the ante and declares in front of the court, "The throne is mine by virtue of my strength. Let Horus prove that he is better than I, and he can have the throne." And Horus, the younger man, responds back, "Challenge me to what you will. I will prove you are the weaker." So, okay, it's good. Now we're on to something. No more taunting. You got the evil uncle, you got the precocious youngster, and they're going to settle this dispute like men. They're going to do it the old-fashioned way by shape-shifting into hippos and seeing who can hold their breath for longer underneath the river. Now, you probably didn't see that coming, but that was their first challenge, and that's what they do. Both Horus and Set become hippos, head down to the bottom of the Nile River, and whoever is going to come up first loses. Okay, simple enough. Should not cause any undue family drama, but not so fast. Once the two hippos head down, now Isis springs into action. Now, again, she's the former queen, Set's sister, Horus's mother, not Isis from, the cousin of Al-Qaeda. This is the old version. And she's clearly got a dog in the hunt. Set killed her husband twice. She really wants her son Horus to take over and win, take over and be king. And remember, Isis is capable, as you said, of some magic. So she magically, once the hippos go underwater, she magically conjures up a harpoon and throws it in the water, aiming at the hippo Set. One thing that's much less magical is her skill at harpoon throwing, because she does not hit Set. In fact, she hits instead the hippo version of her son Horus accidentally. Now, goes back into the water, quickly recovers, takes the harpoon out, aims a second time, and on the second toss, she finally hits the target hippo version of Set. Now, Set's really injured by the harpoon, but in a surprising move, he appeals to Isis to help him out and reminding her that, hey, even though maybe I've done some bad stuff in the past, I'm still your brother. Kind of a desperate move, but he pulls it out. And it's essentially the help a brother out gambit done for the first time. And it actually works. Isis is persuaded. Her heartstrings are pulled. So thanks to some magical help from his sister, from Isis, Set gets out okay, is out of the water. And once Horus in hippo form emerges back, now he's understandably rather miffed at his mom for aiding and abetting his evil uncle in the competition. So Horus is so upset at this betrayal, he decapitates his own mother on the spot. He then takes her head to the top of a mountain and casts it away. Now, you'll notice another instance of displacing of body parts. This is clearly a popular practice in the deities of the era. To his credit, and here's where your boy Thoth gets involved. So as he comes in as the bailiff, he retrieves the head of Isis, puts it back on her body, and heals her. So apparently that's part of the bailiff's charge, and the decapitation is reversed. But with all this unexpected extra carnage, the hippo breath holding contest, it just kind of ends.
You can't call it. Yeah.
No, we're not going to do this again. So they kind of go back to the normal non-human hippo forms and just sort of take a breather after all that. Now, Horus, as you can imagine, exhausted from all the shape shifting, the breath holding, the spearing injury, the mother decapitating. So he's up there on the mountaintop, decides he's going to catch a little bit of shut eye. While he's sleeping, though, old Uncle Set sneaks up on his nephew and gouges out his eyes while he's sleeping.
Yes.
Now, because this is ancient Egypt and there's loose body parts, of course, there's going to be a second step. Would you care to guess what happens to the eyes?
I believe Thoth becomes involved.
Eventually, but first of all, he buries Horus's eyes so he's unable to find them. And this is kind of a good double bind, because without eyes, they're buried, so he won't be able to see them, but he also doesn't have eyes, so he also won't be able to see them. So for some reason, overnight, the eyes bloom into lotus flowers. That detail does not come back, but it's just a nice little poetic touch. In the morning, who should appear in the scene but Hathor from episode 1? The Sky Mother was also sometimes a cow. So Hathor takes pity on Horus, who's now eyeless. She heals his wounds by pouring some gazelle milk on them, restores his sight. You know, the old kind of milk medicine, classic move. And at this point, the tribunal of judges kind of come back and say, all right, guys, come on. We've been through enough here. It's getting a little out of hand. Why don't the two of you just reconcile? And surprisingly, they do. Horus and Set kind of make up, shake hands, and cease their conflict for what will end up to be several hours until the evening rolls around, in which time the feud escalates in a quick and I'd say dramatic fashion. Now, you made some remarks at the beginning, Andrew, about how we need to sort of somehow put wrappers on certain content. We try to make the show pretty family friendly. It's not always easy. I'm going to do my best to keep the next part of the story as clean as I can. I honestly don't know how I'm going to do. So I suppose, listener discretion is advised. Now, I want to say too, rest assured, both Andrew, to you and to listeners, this is not some attempt by me to do some kind of vile comedy, but this is the actual story. This is straight from the documentation, the highly reputable Chester Beatty Papyrus #1, which is the gold standard of papyruses, all the way back from the early Middle Kingdom. So this is as it happened. So Horus and Set, they had this brief truce. It lasts for some of the afternoon till such time as Set decides it would be a good idea to seduce his own nephew. Now, as I understand it, it's a little delicate, but ancient Egypt was not terribly concerned with what we now understand as homosexuality. And so in instances like this, it was most important for some people to just assert dominance over somebody else. So regardless of who you are, you're a man or a woman, you're a stranger, close relative, I guess, certain bad actors like Set, they just wanted to be the aggressor, and they would use sort of seduction as that weapon. So in the original papyrus, the Chester Beatty, there's language about phalluses and stiffening and thighs. For our purposes, we're just going to say that Set had his way with Horus against his young nephew's will. But afterward, kind of on the sly, Horus wants to capture the evidence of this terrible act. So he gathers up his uncle's, we'll call it his seed, in his hands. And then, of course, runs to his mother for help. Now, he's not worried about the fact that he like decapitated her like the day before. In any case, he goes straight to his mom and he says, it's rather formally, given the situation, Horus says, "Help me, Isis, my mother. Come and see what Set has done to me." And he opens up his hands to reveal, well, the evidence that he's gathered up, his uncle's seed. And what does his mother do? Mother Isis, what does she do with this revelation? She immediately grabs a copper knife, cuts off her son's hands. She then goes and fetches some fragrant ointment. Okay, that's nice. Maybe she's going to try to heal him a little bit. No, she applies the ointment to her son's nether regions and works it out so that Horus then deposits his own seed into a pot, of all things. This is probably not the kind of treatment he was looking for from his mother, but it's what he gets. So for her next move, Isis then takes Uncle Set's seed, discards it into the river, into the marshes of the Nile. Another recurring theme in these stories, just chucking stuff into the river. But she takes the seed of her son, Horus, which is in the pot, and heads over to Set's home, specifically to his garden, and encounters Set's gardener. She says, "Hey, your boss, gardener, Set. Just curious, what kind of vegetables does Set enjoy?" And gardener says, "Oh, he doesn't eat any vegetable here in my company except lettuce." All right, so he's a big salad guy. Get it? Fair enough. So Isis, in order to get her revenge, adds her son's seed all over the lettuce that is growing for Set. So over time, Set continues to eat the lettuce, as he does regularly. It's a standing order. And before long, as a result, what? Does he realize that, hey, this isn't Thousand Island? He gets grossed out? No. As a result, upon ingesting the seed of Horus, Set gets pregnant. Now, he doesn't know this news yet, and it's certainly not something he was expecting as part of his sort of lunch routine. But he's feeling pretty good about how he exerted this dominance on Horus. So he goes back to the tribunal with great confidence, and he says, "All right, let me be awarded the office of ruler. For as to Horus, the one who is standing trial, I have performed the labor of a male against him." So clearly, he thinks his dominant seduction move is enough to prove that he's the rightful king. Horus objects, though, and says all that Set has said is false. At this point, in my view, he calls the most unusual witness in the trial that I've ever heard of. And he essentially says, "Let's summon your seed and see what it has to say on the matter." And at that moment, from the marshes alongside the Nile, where Isis had dumped it, the seed answers back and calls back in response. Now, at this point, Thoth steps in. Now, again, he's the bailiff. Thoth puts his hand on Set's shoulder, and he says it's only fair to summon the seed of Horus. So he calls the seed of Horus to the stand, which at this point, Set has ingested within the lettuce leaves. So wouldn't you know it, as soon as called to the witness stand, Horus's seed answers from inside of Set because he's been impregnated by lettuce. We're keeping up so far. So this divine seed is way too important to just kind of trickle out his ear or whatever. So it emerges from Set's head in the form of giving birth to a giant golden solar disk. Now, at this point, Thoth immediately grabs the disk away and puts it on his own head as a crown. So this is, at least according to the story, where that disk upon Thoth's head originally comes from.
Okay.
So some dispute about solar versus lunar. I've seen both accounts, but if anybody ever asks, "Hey, Thoth, where'd you get that cool hat?" Well, he's got a story for you. So
glad you asked.
Yes. So you would think, even after this fairly damning evidence in a really dramatic courtroom moment, this would be game over. But no, Set convinces the judges to hold one more competition because they haven't been able to decide yet. They're still deadlocked in this judge panel. Just how about a boat race? Let's keep it simple. So they have a boat race down the Nile, but a very specific sort. It's going to be a race of ships, and the ships have to be made of stone. So each of them has a ship. The race begins, and it ends really quickly because Set's boat instantly sinks to the bottom of the Nile, perhaps because, as I said, it is made of stone, which tends not to float. Somehow, though, Horus's ship floats along just fine, and it appears he's going to win. But it is discovered that he cheated and, in fact, made the ship out of pine which does float, and covered it in gypsum, which looks kind of like a plaster to make it look like stone. Yeah. Well, Set sees this, is furious that his opponent has cheated. So he again does what any normal human being would do, transforms himself into a hippopotamus once more, bashes his head into the side of his rival's ship. It breaks into splinters and exposes Horus's deceit and cheating. So these are only a few chapters, Andrew, of this ongoing battle. And these shenanigans go, and they include the removal of testicles, the removal and reinsertion of eyes. There's mutilation. They're somehow restored. Again, 80 years of this. And eventually, growing a little bit understandably weary of all this bizarre violence, the judges finally say, all right, we're going to take this to a higher court. We're not going to decide in this tribunal. We're going to send it to Osiris. We're going to elevate it, who is the Lord of the underworld. He'll decide who should be king. Now, of course, Osiris, in this case, has to choose between his own son and brother, who had killed him, but not once, but twice. So unsurprisingly, he chooses his son, Horus. Set is chained up and finally concedes, which is, to say the least, an inglorious conclusion. Now, I will point out that in some traditions of this story, most of the traditions of the story, Set is bound in chains, in some cases sent to the underworld. There are a few stories that the little small things he's known for doing afterward, but this is essentially the kind of disgrace that he goes down into. But I should say, in full disclosure, there are artistic renderings of Horus and Set making up at the end and co-ruling together to the point where there are images of them both on the same throne. There are images of them, two heads coming out of the same body. Now, I don't know, guys. After all these two have been through, this strikes me as the first instance of a detail of the story that I don't really buy. I don't think that could happen. That is implausible.
Just that part. Just that part.
That's finally something that just rubs me the wrong way. So we'll assume that, in fact, according to most stories, Horus was the winner, and Set goes away in shame. That said, he does have kind of a little second act. He becomes a protector of Ra, the sun god. So he becomes part of that solar bark ship that rides across the sky.
Right.
And is a good protector. He's able to defend Ra from an attack by Apep, who is the kind of serpent-based opponent of light and truth, a very tough enemy. Now, beyond that, though, some say he helps in the underworld to shepherd some souls to the underworld to Osiris. But even that sounds a little implausible, that after all that, Osiris would kind of be his boss. So we'll leave that with a grain of salt. But he becomes an outsider for obvious reasons. He's worshipped still, but only in the kind of outside of Egypt, because he is the god of foreigners. So in the sticks, he still does have a little bit of a following.
Yeah.
But over time, there's a period in the second intermediate period, 1550 BCE, where Lower Egypt is conquered by Near Eastern peoples known as the Hyksos, who like the fact that Set was the god of foreigners. It's like, hey, we're foreigners too. Cool. So they bring him back, and they begin to worship Set once they take control. Later on, in the third intermediate and late periods, Egypt is conquered by other outsiders. Now we get to the Kushite, the Persian empires. At this point, the original kind of native Egyptians who are left are like, they're just tired of all these foreigners. And so they say, Set, god of foreigners, we're going to double down. We're going to demonize and vilify you yet again. So in the end, he becomes largely vilified, really seen as this agent of chaos, this bad guy, with the exception of just a few little outposts way out in the sticks. So in conclusion, I think you can see, even from this selection of stories, that Set was the god of chaos for a reason. I think his dramatic overthrow of Osiris would have been enough on his own to kind of claim that title. But these contendings of Set with Horus really take his awfulness to a new level. And to be fair, not everyone around him behaved great either. You got the hippo breath holding contest, some clear interference in that. The seed-based shenanigans. There were a number of parties involved. He wasn't the only bad guy in these stories, but probably still the worst. And I guess to his credit, he showed a sense of fair play in using a real stone ship in the boat race. Didn't cheat, but he got, well, what did he get for that? It sunk and he lost the entire conflict. So in the end, if nothing else, for all of his many, many terrible traits, if nothing else, the god of chaos did truly live up to his name and was chaotic.
That he did. Yeah.
So there you go. There's
for sure.
There's our competition for the second part to go against
quite
Thoth.
A contrast.
Yes, quite a contrast. So we'll process the stories we've just heard.
Take a break.
Take a break and get back for our rounds right after this.
All right.
right, and we are back to our 5 categories that are going to determine the winner between these two gods, Set and Thoth. And we start off, as always, with Immortal Combat. And that is simply who would win in a physical confrontation between these two gods. And I'll go first, give a little bit of what I see in Thoth. So, unlike Seth, there aren't too many stories where Thoth is engaging in combat. You know, he's more of an advisor, more of a thinker, more of a writer.
Right.
In the Distant Goddess, you know, he puts himself in danger when he's confronting the fire-breathing lioness version of Tefnut. And there he used his smooth-talking baboon form in order to diffuse the conflict and avoid it.
Right.
But does not actually engage her in battle. And then when Ra has his unreasonable curse on Nut, Thoth goes about finding a loophole and tricks the moon into giving him his way and allowing Nut to give birth. So, he certainly will use his magic occasionally to harm others. He's not above throwing a child or a woman into a river using his magic.
Sure.
As we saw, he could perform the role of executioner on behalf of Ra when given the order.
Yeah.
And interestingly, there's not a lot of detail that I could find on this, but there's maybe not quite the gold standard papyrus, but the Jumhilhak papyrus, and that has some writings about the contentions of Horus and Set, and in that papyrus it says that Thoth and Set had an actual physical altercation.
Oh, so we have some real data on this. Yeah,
it has some real data on that, and that Set attacked Thoth and cuts his arm off and throws Thoth's books and his arm in the river, probably shouting "nerd" while doing so.
You probably gave him an atomic wedgie on the way down to the Nile. Yeah.
Yes, the Thoth does retrieve his arm and uses his own magic to put it back on himself.
Sure.
So that's what I have on Thoth in combat. Not a huge record there.
Yeah, it's a hard one. I think in some ways, Set is a formidable foe. I mean, we know from the overthrow of Osiris that if nothing else, he wasn't afraid to recruit people from the dark corners of society to do his bidding. So he could gather up some goons when he needed to. He was clearly not hesitant to use all tactics at his disposal. You know, eye extraction, arm removal, and river throwing, as you said, burial, dismemberment, forced seduction of relatives. Nothing was off the table. Somehow he still has decent relationships with his family members, even after all those 80 years, despite some terrible behavior. So he could have some other kind of potentially some allies on his side, despite all that. We do know that one thing I learned and didn't know this, so he was actually very strong, and not only was he able to overthrow, but he did have some might and was seen as was feared as being strong himself. So even though he did often delegate the dirty work, he had some strength. And that's seen in the ability to repel Apep, that serpent god, to keep Ra safe, to give the boss a solid. So I guess it's probably safe to say that he had the capability, he had certainly the motivation to, when in a confrontation, to go after his opponent. I guess the only two kind of question marks would be, in a conflict of sort of wisdom versus brawn, can a Thoth type figure kind of outwit a Set who is not really known to be the brightest of bulbs, perhaps, but something tells me the other kind of question mark would be, after all that Set has been through, his hippo-related injuries, his postpartum solar disk situation, does he still have it in him to be at fighting strength? I think, given all we know about chaos being his brand in a physical conflict, terrible of a divine being as Set was, I think I have to give him the nod to be the victor in that confrontation.
Yeah, there's certainly Thoth has this reputation. He's a great magician in addition to all these other things.
That's true.
But we don't really, get a lot of solid evidence on what that is and how that would play out in a combat situation. they both can kind of turn into any animal they want.
Right.
Those sorts of things. So I don't think there's really any advantage there. So I just think that Set also has kind of a God of War thing. So I'm
Yes.
going to go with Set on the Immortal Kombat. So I think we're in agreement there.
I think you're right.
All right, so that is 1 for Set, and that brings us to our second round, which is Curriculum Deity, which is simply who would you rather be? Who would you rather follow? Who has that it factor? And I believe you're going to go first on this one, Matt.
Yeah, there's really nothing about Set that I would aspire to as a as a figure. I mean, I suppose if I had to say something, it would be kind of cool to have your own animal, I guess. But even then, it was considered a fictional animal. So if I really wanted to, I could sort of invent a Matasaurus of some kind and get that. In terms of his ongoing troubles, as a Irish Catholic raised to suppress emotions and avoid conflict, I would not do well with an 80-year legal battle of any kind, particularly with family members. So I don't think that would be my bag. I also, admittedly, I do enjoy salad on a regular basis, and I would want to continue to enjoy it without worrying about the origins of any of the dressing that I might encounter. So, in terms of wanting to be one, it doesn't seem like a happy life. Chaos was not terribly good at governing. Even when he murdered people, he had to murder them twice. Clearly, some sticky family situations. So, not a lot of high points for who I'd rather be. In terms of worship, and I alluded to this before, he was from Upper Egypt, so the kind of more of the desert part of the country, out in the boonies and outside the borders. He would still have some temples even after his disgrace. There was an important one in a place called Sepermeru. Okay. There was a secondary shrine inside the original shrine called the House of Set. Powerful is his mighty arm. Kind of interesting. Some of Set's temples also did have a House of Nephthys as wife, which I think is on one hand is kind of nice that they get to be together over all these years in worship. That said, I can't believe their marriage would be terribly strong after Set's level of peccadillos, let's say. So I'm not sure it was really great for them to be with each other to eternity. In terms of events that would be happening in the worship realm, so Edfu, which is part of the cult of Osiris, of course, is his brother but enemy. Every year, the priests would hold this ritual in sort of dishonor of Set, where they would castrate and dismember a donkey, essentially in dishonor to remind them of how much they disliked Set. But at the same time, kind of puzzling, a lot of ancient Egyptians were still perfectly fine worshiping over certain periods, worshiping Set and Osiris and Isis at the same time.
Okay.
Even though they were very much on different teams. And I couldn't understand why this was, but then I kind of saw in one book it made a lot of sense. Not only did they not want to pick a team, but the way they saw it when it comes to Ma'at, this sort of sense of Egyptian divine balance, you had to have chaos in order for peace to have any meaning. So even though Set was this chaotic being, he was part of the overall balance of things. So as a worship experience, it wasn't great. You had to go looking for one of these temples. They were not in favor for most periods. They had certain areas of invasion, as I said, where they came back and he became in favor. Yeah. But as a whole, probably more of an embarrassment to worship that than anything else. So not really good ranks for me on either being or worshiping the god of chaos.
All right, we'll see how that compares because we don't get a lot of details on the family life for Thoth. He may have had that girlfriend in Mahat, and then the wife, and then there's the goddess Seshat, who was reportedly his daughter. She was goddess of scribes and measurements and rituals. So he had a little bit of a family life, not quite the chaos that of course Set had. But mostly Thoth seems like kind of a workaholic. He's advising the god pharaohs. He's always writing a book. He also would spend some time during the day guiding the Sunbark along with Mahat, his ex-girlfriend by that point, I guess.
It's still working together on friendly terms, clearly.
Yeah, they had a working relationship. So he also recorded the judgments on souls. So they would do that balancing act. And he would be pictured down in the underworld in baboon form, writing down, keeping track of the record of what actually was decided.
Sure.
And he had some moon regulation responsibilities, so that's a little bit vague. So he was very, very busy.
Yeah.
But he spent some time in the underworld. But he had a great deal of magical abilities with medicine and other areas, and the writing. He had a creative outlet with the writing, which seems like a plus. And yet again, we're looking at a god who spends a good amount of time with a bird head. I think should be said.
That's true.
He's got an ibis head. But one advantage of that is apparently ibises have a special ability to find food underground by detecting the vibration through their beaks. So,
well, there's a plus.
If you're a little peckish, you can just I hear I feel the grubs underground.
That would come in handy sometimes. Yeah,
snack time. But he could be in other forms, so that is a personal choice.
Yes.
In terms of worship, Thoth had a couple of big temples that were dedicated just to him, and then in addition to that, in many of the other temples, there'd be a little Thoth section, a little Thoth shrine within it, because he was such a helper deity and it was involved with so many myths that there'd be a little bit of Thoth action. So you could go
like a best supporting actor Oscar. Yeah, that's nice.
You go either to the big ones or you could go to the little ritual one. So there's some convenience there,
right?
And there was one big Thoth festival that was around the calendar. Our calendar would have been August 6th, and it's kind of sandwiched between the death of Osiris Fest and the Drunken Goddess Festival of Hathor that we talked about at our first Egyptian episode.
Right.
So this one is also, it's a little bit in temperament in between kind of the mournful Osiris Fest and the wild abandonment of the Drunken Goddess Festival. It's a little bit more of a medium fest. It's kind of pulling you back up from the low to the high. So
yeah, you need a little transition there. I can understand that.
And of course, as I mentioned, the ibis was sacred to Thoth. And so at a couple of his largest temples, the priests would raise huge flocks of ibises, and devotees could contribute to the bird's care. Even though through the royal family there was a royal farm called the Fields of the Ibis that was dedicated just to growing grain for these sacred birds. However, if you wanted to go one step further, and you didn't want to pay for the care of one of the birds, you could pay to have one killed. And you would pay to have it killed and sacrifice one to Thoth, one of his sacred ibises.
Yeah.
And not only were they sacrificed, the ibises were then mummified.
Oh.
And then it's the mummification that is going to send the bird's soul back to Thoth. And probably during his break time when he's adjudicating human souls, the worshippers would slip a message in with the bird mummy, so that when Thoth receives the bird mummy, their little message would fall out and say, "Oh, can you help me with this thing?" So at these two different temples, archaeologists have found 4 million ibis bird mummies at one, and nearly 2 million at the other. So there are at least 6 million of these found.
They found these like in modern day?
Yes, the modern day have these mummies.
Wow.
However, with that kind of volume, inevitable that there were a few corners could get cut, and so X-rays on these mummies have revealed that only about a third of them had the whole bird in it. And some of them had just a piece of the bird, or it could be as small as having a feather.
That's pretty
sneaky.
And
then, we have one recording from a priest of Thoth in a writing called the Archive of Horror, about the scandal in this, where the priests who were cutting the ibis product without the knowledge of the customers were actually put on trial.
So justice
Again,
was served. Yes.
yeah. So there's a lot of options. Just that caveat emptor. If you're getting your ibis mummified, make sure that you're getting the whole bird.
That's common knowledge right there. That's just conventional wisdom.
Yeah, you just got to be cautious with those ibis sacrifices. So, all that said, I think I'm gonna have to go with Thoth on this one. The being, I feel like, is definite, and the worship, even though maybe bird mummification's not like a hobby that I'm looking to pick up. I think there were other options that you could probably just skip that piece of it.
Yeah, I join you. I think Thoth is the easy choice there. There's very, very little to like about the being or worshiping of Set. So I think we share the vote on curriculum deity.
All right, that brings us to 1-1, and brings us to good God, and that is simply who has the better character, who's the better deity. So, I think in season 1 we would say mixed bag a lot. And
yes,
I don't know. I don't know how much of a mixed bag these two are, but we'll see. So overall, I think Thoth actually comes out pretty well in this.
Yeah.
In that Curse of Nut, Goddess of the Heavens, clearly Thoth is the one who's in the right, and Ra is in the wrong, and Thoth takes a little bit of a risk to set that to right. Uses his stealth and guile. So I think that was a good one. In the Osiris myth and the contentions of Horus and Set, I think Thoth is mostly in the positive light, mostly on the right side, acting as that bailiff, sometimes a mediator. He saves baby Horus. He magically reattaches some genitals, and he magically reattaches some eyes. So I think he got pretty well there. And then there's this religious text known as the Bleecker Papyrus, and it says of Thoth that Thoth, the legislature in heaven and on earth, he who sees to it that the gods remain within the limits of their competency. Each guild fulfills its obligations, and countries know their frontiers and the fields of their opportunities. So, kind of interesting there. He kind of is part of keeping things together, keeping order. Making sure the gods themselves don't step out of their competency. Make sure Tefnut doesn't start playing with fire, the goddess of moisture. Just stay in your lane.
Right.
So he's upholding Mahat and that divine order. And then in the afterlife, it is Baboon Thoth who's recording judgments. So he's got kind of a bureaucratic role, but I think one that is a positive contribution. One downside that Setne and Nanifer's story, he probably didn't really need to kill the kid.
No.
So he probably could have done without the child murder.
I think so. He was committed at that point. He was just going to go whole hog. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that one goes in the moral loss column, but
on the whole, the legend still comes out okay. Yeah.
Right. And then the other one about the book. So if the book is that dangerous, did he really need to write it down? Maybe that was a mistake.
That could have been
of just creating it in the first place. But he wanted to remember that stuff. So overall, I'd say he comes out, as I said, pretty well.
Yeah. My entry in the character ledger will be relatively short. I think for Set, not a lot to add. I mean, you've heard the tales. A lot, very selfish, violent, sneaky. Couple quick things about protecting Rosh, sure. Maybe ushering souls in the afterlife. Okay. There's something compelling about producing that sense of balance with chaos versus peace, but even that seems like kind of a stretch. I did not mention. I think I mentioned Set came from the upper part of Egypt, which was known as the red part of the country. It was where the deserts were. Yeah. So he, apart from everything else, he also sort of sowed polarization within Egypt, where not only were these sort of political, power seizing battles with Osiris, and then later with Set, but he also sort of had his own people from his part of the country really rally against the interests of the other. So to add to everything else in the character department, he was also a bit of a political rabble rouser on top of everything else. So nothing really good to say beyond a couple of small items there. So I will gladly give Thoth the character thumbs up on this one. The intellect, yes, the couple of items you mentioned in the lost column, but for the most part, it seems like he got a lot of things done. Was living a life of wisdom and letters, and I fully respect that, and cannot, with any good conscience, give Set a vote on this. So it goes to Thoth for my side of the question.
All right, yeah, and I will certainly agree with that. And so that puts us at 2-1 for Thoth. But then it brings us to round 4, which is iconography.
Mm-hmm.
And that is who has the better legacy today, who's more influential throughout history. And I believe this is your turn to go first again.
Yeah. So, it's a little tricky on the legacy question with some of these Egyptian guys. They just don't have as much sort of longevity in the culture as some of the folks from the Greco-Roman tradition. That said, at the time, Set was associated with planet Mercury. He did have a sort of planetary association. Then again, it's now known as Mercury, so that legacy is not as strong.
Yeah.
If anything, it maybe speaks to the legacy of Freddie Mercury, if that's what it's called. But no, he had a planet, but kind of doesn't anymore. There's an anime series, of course, called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Stardust Crusaders, that features a minor enemy named Alessi, based on Set, who can rapidly de-age anybody who steps in his shadow, which I thought was an interesting ability. Not sure how closely that relates to the story of Set, but it's out there in the arts. Of course, the word Set has lots of meanings in math and computing. I'm guessing because of the god's inclination toward chaos rather than order. Don't think there's a connection between math and computing with this fella. Set is also the name of the den for a badger. And apparently the badger den is quite sophisticated. So I did not know this. The largest set for badgers can have tunnels of up to 1,000 feet. They have 40 openings, as many as 40 openings. They can have 15 badgers who live in them. So a badger set is quite impressive.
Isn't it, though?
I can't give Set, the god, a ton of credit for that. Set is also the acronym for the Science, Engineering, and Technology Student of the Year Awards, which are given to outstanding undergraduates in the UK. Although, again, I don't suspect the award ceremony has any kind of like hippo-based contest, eye gouging, any sort of seed-related sabotage. I hope not.
No.
Those
No.
hard-studying Brits, they deserve better. And of course, the Set is your basic formation in square dancing. It is your unit of play in the game of tennis. It is your group of repetitions when you're weight training, and it is the volleyball move between the bump and the spike. It's very hard to go straight from the bump to the spike. You got to have the Set in the middle for the most part. So very few of these I can attribute to Set the god.
Right.
And so legacy wise, fairly weak, but that's about the best I got.
All right. So, Thoth, like Set, he had a month in the Egyptian calendar, roughly September 11th to October 11th. And that is still used in the Coptic calendar by rural Egyptians. So there are some people out there who are using that. One of Thoth's epithets I mentioned at the beginning was Thoth the Thrice Great.
Right.
And I don't know if you recall this, but from our Hermes episode in season 1, but that was synchronized with Hermes. So all that Hermeticom came out of a combination of Greek Egyptians during the Hermes reign in Egypt, and so really sort of a Thoth Hermes collabo, and that's where we get these dialogues about alchemy and philosophy.
Okay,
that went on to influence the occult throughout the Middle Ages and into the 19th century. So a little part credit there to Thoth.
Nice. Collabo.
He is he is a character in the video game Smite. He's also a character in one of the versions of Assassin's Creed. That's
sure.
a Thoth character, so it's a little video game
life
to him. So the early 20th century cultist and general weirdo Aleister Crowley
Yeah.
came out with his own Thoth tarot card set. So one of the that was in 1943. Then we get Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a short story titled "The Ring of Thoth." So that's a pretty good get.
Sure.
Then we have the Thoth Tower, which is a space launch platform by the Canadian company Thoth Technologies, that was proposed in 2015 and has so far not been built. And then there's a couple different books here, and so there's one called "The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean." And so I'm going to read you a little bit of the blurb about that. It's kind of interesting. So it is the spiritual, occult, and historical significance of the Emerald Tablets is almost beyond belief of modern man. Written around 36,000 BC by Thoth the Atlantean priest king, this manuscript dates far back beyond the reach of any Egyptian writings ever found. The author, Thoth, a master teacher of the early Egyptians, put this treatise to writing in his native Atlantean language, and Dr. Doriel, by use of the expertise as an occultist and master of time and space, was given directive to retrieve these tablets and translate them to English for the edification of modern man. And so it kind of goes on and on about this. And when I was first reading this, I thought that this was a fiction book, but this is not. This is, well,
or some sort of L. Ron Hubbard sequel. I can't quite tell.
No, yeah, you're closer to the truth there. So it says, Miss Dr. Doriel is the spiritual leader, teacher of the multitude of seekers of light, having founded the metaphysical church and college, the Brotherhood of the White Temple. And so it goes on, and so the Brotherhood of the White Temple Incorporated is a correspondence school accredited through the state of Colorado and mails out its worldwide membership weekly. Lessons of Truth.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That I did not see that coming.
And so the author was Maurice Doriel, which was a pseudonym for Claude Dodgen, was his original name, and he was an occultist who lived in Denver, Colorado, establishing the Brotherhood of the White Temple in 1933. And this little blurb about him says that in 1929, Doriel's astral self still would have been in Tibet studying esoteric knowledge, while his physical self was driving a cab in Wichita.
Wow. That's just crazy enough to be true. I can't believe after spending a few years in Denver, you didn't become entwined with this
I know I missed it out, but I mean it's a correspondence school, so really anybody.
I guess it could be anybody.
And I like that. I like that they're still sticking with the snail mail. They haven't put it up on the internet. So,
wow.
And then there's also a Thoth romance novel, but I think it can't quite live up to the Emerald Tablets.
No, that's wow. Well, this is practically a no-brainer. I think if I'd known that Thoth had that kind of legacy, we wouldn't have had the discussion. So definitely gets my vote. Fully Thoth on this one.
Yeah, I think he does. Yeah, he got that in the bag. He's got poultice all over. It's got half credit on the Hermeticom. That puts it Thoth, and he has this in the bag. But as ever, we are completists.
Yes,
and we're gonna complete all 5 rounds. So that's gonna take us to our final round, which is Matinee Idol, and that is who would make the better movie or limited series.
Yeah,
and with this one, I'm gonna go first. And so the thought I had here is kind of an action comedy limited series. So the main character is Sammy Thoth, who is a 30-year-old professional student with 22 degrees. He's kind of an uber nerd, but he's been booted out of school because he has all of the degrees that they can give. So
out of school, he decides to write a book with all of the esoteric knowledge of the world that has filled his brain, the significance of which is almost beyond the belief of modern man.
Right.
So he realizes, after he's gotten this all out on paper, he realizes that the knowledge is just too advanced and too dangerous for the rest of civilization, and decides not to go through with publishing it. But shortly after he makes that decision and informs his editor, the manuscript has been stolen, and he must become more than just a writer. He must become a hunter for his own occult texts and books. Unfortunately, Sammy Thoth cannot fight his way out of a wet paper bag. So alongside him, he has his friend Shu Robinson comes along, and Teffy, his sort of split personality, sometimes girlfriend.
Right.
And together they're going to go seek the Book of the Gods, only to find that it is with the nefarious Apophis Serpent Brotherhood. And then three countries later, the trouble continues, but so does the fun.
Very nice. Any casting on that, or did you?
Oh yeah, so I had on that Sam Richardson and Tim Robinson as Sam Richardson as Thoth, and Tim Robinson as his brother and friend Shu Robinson. And I didn't come up with a Tefnut as casting on that one.
Well, we'll leave that to Hollywood to figure out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So, comedy adventure story.
Very nice. Well, this was a very interesting challenge for the story of Set, and I know what you're thinking, Andrew. I mean, with a tale like that, what a tale for the cinema! Twists and turns, so many entanglements, right. so much drama. But frankly, I kept coming back to the fact that Set himself is a pretty heinous lead character, pretty bad creature. I don't think today's movie-going public would have a lot of tolerance, frankly, for the antics that he showed throughout his career. That said, we also, no matter what era, we love films about how the sins of parents kind of ripple down through history to the next generation, who either fall into the same patterns as their parents or they fight to reverse them and be their own people. So you recall very early on in this conversation, along with his wife, Set also had these clandestine affairs with a couple of foreign goddesses, Anat and Asart. And you'll also recall from those unions came his love child, a crocodile deity named, as I mentioned, Maga. So I'm picturing a cartoon coming-of-age film, feature film with a young little critter, little crocodile god, called Growing Up Maga. Now, that name is going to conjure up, let's say, certain expectations, even if you're an adorable young animated crocodile. So, but it asks these big questions about what are the expectations upon you. So what, for starters, what if you loved your country, but your mom was someone your dad found in a foreign land? Okay. What if your dad had lots of weird kind of dalliances based on dominance, so you never knew how many more siblings were eventually going to show up? And as our friend Maga asks himself throughout the film, what if your dad, let's just say, took over the leadership of a country under dubious circumstances and then governed in a manner that was pure chaos? Let's also say your dad really only stood up for the red part of the country and made it go against the rest of the country, just out of theoretical. Now, what if dad went to great lengths to then exact vengeance on his predecessor in governing the country? What if he kept using hired goons to take care of all of his dirty work, but they never quite got the job done? What's it like having a dad who's tied up in legal battles for decades? How do you grow up that way? Whenever he gets defeated, what if your dad just blames the person who beat him, claims everything's rigged? So this is the choice that little Maga has. Do I want to be like that father figure? Or would I learn from that? Maybe live a different life. You treat that as a cautionary tale. After all, lots of people around him seem to like chaos for some reason. And ultimately, his dad's not going to be of much help because he doesn't talk to him much, doesn't have a lot of advice. They hardly ever talk. The only advice his dad ever gives him is, hey, son, sometimes bad things happen to people who eat too much lettuce. So stay away from it, unless it's on a Big Mac, in which case you're fine. So audiences can find out what direction this confused little crocodile chooses in Growing Up Maga, a new animated film with a surprisingly convincing vocal performance in the title role from Donald Trump Jr. And there,
Thought you were
there's
gonna thought you were gonna go with Eric, but all right.
yes, parallel lives, it would seem.
Yeah.
Very interesting, let's just say metaphors at play with that story.
Right. Yeah. That is interesting. All right. So yeah, I think two interesting stories going different directions. Glad to see pulled out the animated version.
Yes,
So
mix it up.
yeah.
I'm at a loss. Do you have a vote winner in this one?
No, I think they're real close. I think I'm gonna go with growing up MAGA. So
I think I will as well. I am torn
Yeah.
because I think as familiar as that subject matter seems to be, I think we need a whole new lens on what that experience must be like for a creature with that kind of misfortune and chaos around him. So,
yeah, from that perspective, yeah.
yeah, you don't think about it. You know, it's a crocodile with a heart of something. Gold, we'll find out. Well, I guess
All
that
right.
means that despite the final finish from Set, the Golden Ale, formerly the Golden Apple,
Yeah.
goes to Thoth, I believe.
Yeah, 3-2. Yes, that is
3-2.
correct.
Well, it's
There
been
we go.
another fine adventure here. As always, Andrew, our thanks to our friend Andy Snow, the DJ,
Yes.
for the fine theme music. I also want to give thanks to there's a travel blog called the Not So Innocents Abroad that provided some inspiration from the Horace and Set tale here. Some things apart from the traditional text that were inspirational. So thanks to the authors of that. And of course, as always, tell your friends, leave a review, leave a good review. See us on the socials. We'll be back with our next episode before too long. Look forward to that as always. But if there's nothing else, I think we can call it a day.
All right, plan it out.
Sounds great. We will see you next time, folks. Thanks for listening.